Hello, this is Emily, and I hope you are having a truly marvelous day today. In this video, I want to talk to you about the pros and cons of the irrigation planters, otherwise known as SIP raised beds. So you know when somebody comes up to you and they say, I've got good news and bad news, which one do you want to hear first? Usually you say, I want to hear the bad news. So, in the spirit of following that tradition, I'm going to start with the cons, the disadvantages of sub-irrigated raised beds. And the most obvious one is cost. It costs money to buy the lumber and build the box. And if you don't have the power tools, you may be able to borrow them. Otherwise, they would cost money too. So let's just stick with the actual materials needed to make the sub-irrigation bed. So yeah, the lumber costs money, the screws cost money. If you use pond liner is pretty much the most expensive thing you can use to line it. 10 mil builder's plastic is less expensive, but it still costs. The soil above anything else, you've got to use a potting mix. You know, you can't just dig up dirt out of your garden and fill it up. That's not going to work. The perforated corrugated drain pipe on the bottom, that all costs money. Now there is a less expensive to do sub-irrigation beds. Another term going around is wicking beds, and I think they're interchangeable. These beds are wicking beds because through the perforated corrugated drain pipe and up into the soil, the water is wicked. I mean, they really are wicking beds. And the things that are called wicking beds are actually also sub-irrigation beds because you fill it up from the bottom. However, for some reason, online people have made a distinction between the two. And I'm going to put a link below to a video that shows you how you can build a wicking bed for really, really inexpensive. Instead of going out and buying lumber, you scavenge up some wood pallets. And the wood pallets obviously are going to have big gaps in between, so what you do is you go around and scavenge some political signs that you put on the inside to fill up the holes, and so on and so forth. There are lower cost ways to make a wicking bed or sub-irrigation bed. But still, I mean, right out of the gate, there's at least some cost to a sub-irrigation bed. A second con to using sub-irrigation beds is a con that people will apply to hydroponics, to container gardening when using plastic containers, and on, and it's the use of plastic. Now, treated lumber could be an issue, although I understand that they no longer put the nasty chemical that was really bad into treated lumber. But in a sub-irrigated bed, it's lined. It's the plastic that has contact with the water and the soil, not the lumber. But a lot of people have issues with plastic. Well, I'm just going to say a couple of things. Okay, first of all, plastic really doesn't it doesn't break down to an extent to where it's really toxic. It doesn't start to deteriorate like that unless and until it is exposed to light and heat. Now some might say, well, there's some evidence that even like in a sub-irrigated bed where it's covered all the time, well, it still is it's slowly leaching out toxins. First of all, I don't think anyone's actually proved that, but second of all, it happens so slowly that, number one, the leaching process happens so slowly that whatever might end up in your food is going to be extremely minimal. And the other thing is that a lot of compounds used to make plastics, such as BPA, are too big for the plant roots to absorb. So these toxins, some of these toxins people are afraid of, can't even be absorbed by the plant, so it's not even an issue. But mainly the big thing is if you have a plastic container that is exposed to sunlight over long periods of time or to heat, that's what deteriorates it, and that's what causes the toxins. As it begins to degrade, that's when the toxins are released. That's not going to happen in a sub-irrigated bed because everything's covered with soil. A third con to sub-irrigation beds is the time it takes to build them. I say that, okay. My husband estimated that it took probably, if he would have done it straight on You know, for one day it would have taken him between 10 and 12 hours to build one 10 by 3 bed. You know, of course the time changes depending on how big you build the bed. But, you know, you have to build the boxes here and, you know, put on those braces, and then you have to line it and figure out all the drain pipe, measure that and cut it up and all that other stuff. The soil, putting the soil in. But as far as that goes, remember that, I mean, one and done, right? You do it and it's built. Once you build it, it's done, it's finished. And if you've used if you've used good quality material, it's going to last for years and years and years. Compare that with growing something in the ground where you're having to constantly bend over or squat or kneel, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. But it's actually a lot more physical work to work at ground level. Even a 6-inch raised bed that a lot of gardeners are doing and recommend doing and promote, that's still pretty low to the ground. And you still, you know, you have to deal with some sort of irrigation system, setting up drip irrigation, soaker hose. Both of those, you know, you're having to constantly adjust because you might not get it quite right. Soaker hoses are a major pain. I've tried them. Sprinklers waste water. They're easy, but they waste water. So, you know, anything that might save you time in a regular bed at ground level can end up, you know, being wasteful. So in my opinion, in other words, I don't think the time built really counts that much. The time taken to build an SIP bed. The last con of an SIP bed is that it is so far up off the ground. And not so much that it's so far up off the ground, but it doesn't have contact with the ground. We have a layer of carpet under here, and then there's plastic. It's not direct contact with the dirt. And so when it freezes, and especially when there's a really hard freeze, you know, like 10 degrees or something like that, when it gets really, really cold, it's not going to be, the soil is not going to stay as warm necessarily as a regular raised bed, like a 6 to 12-inch raised bed. That's another con, and it's something to think about, especially if you're a gardener up north with a shorter growing season.
Now let's talk about the good stuff.
Yeah, let's talk about the pros. Pro number 1, the height. The height, you see how high it is? 18 inches. You could make it higher, but 18 inches is pretty standard. 18 inches. Here I am, touching the peas, okay? Look at me. Look at me. This is as far as I have to bend to touch the top of the bed. Not far at all. I don't have to kneel, I don't have to squat, I don't have to do anything that will strain my back to work in these garden beds. Second pro, extremely easy to water. Stick the hose in the fill pipe, turn on your water, and when you start to see water dripping out of here, turn off your hose, you're done. Now this can take time. If you wait until all the 55 gallons are depleted at the bottom of the reservoir, it can take you a half hour or more to fill it up with a hose. Well, you know, that's what your smartphone and MP3 players and your Kindles, that's what all those things are for. You know, bring out something to entertain yourself while you're waiting. Or if once you get experienced and you have an idea how long it's going to take, you can turn on the hose, leave it, and come check on it every 10, 15 minutes or whatever. But this watering only needs to be done every 2 to 4 weeks, depending on how hot it is. Speaking of water, you don't waste water. This was another biggie for me, why I wanted to get out of in-ground water. Because of the soil we have and the sandstone bedrock that's underneath, much of our property, just 2 to 3 feet down, when you water here, I mean, a lot of it just kind of disappears into a black hole. You end up wasting water. You pour water on plants, then they don't get most of what you put on them. Now, I could spend the next 5 years putting straw and wood chips and just constantly piling up. And eventually, yeah, I would have nice cemented soil, maybe 6 inches deep, maybe not quite that deep, but after 5 years it would be nice enough so that I wouldn't totally waste it. But I'm going to tell you what, even if you follow somebody's recipe for, a raised bed soil, and whether you use peat moss or coconut coir or whatever, you can use whatever gardening guru's formula for their raised bed, how to amend the soil or what to put in a raised bed, whatever. Well, you know what? That raised bed it still has contact with the regular dirt underneath, right? So there's always going to be some water that escapes down and it goes away and is not able to be utilized by your crops. But this has a plastic lining. It makes all of the water stay here. All of the water in here. Now some of it I am going to do, eventually I'm going to mulch all of this, either with wood chips or more cardboard, probably a mix, so that I don't have any potting mix exposed. If you keep it exposed, obviously, water will evaporate out of it. Here are my notes for the pros and cons, by the way. But other than that, water doesn't get wasted. Another pro, looking at it right here, it's very easy to add infrastructure to these raised beds because they're so high. So this is my pea/pole bean trellis. The lumber is just the stakes are screwed on to the ends, like that. Tomato stakes. PVC we had lying around, strapped on to the sides. Our cucumber trellis attached to the end. Another con, and this is a huge one for a lot of people, grass cannot get into it because it is self-contained. It's like a giant pot. Like a giant pot. You can't, your Bermuda grass, your St. Augustine, none of those kinds of grasses that creep along the ground. They're not going to be able to creep into your bed. Even people with, fairly decently raised beds, even a foot off the ground and they've got cinder blocks as borders, they still get grass in their beds. It won't happen with an SIP bed. Another pro, soil quality. You can control the soil quality. Now you can control it somewhat in native soil by adding amendments, but there's always the disadvantages of native soil are always going to be there despite the amendments. You can control the soil quality of what goes in here, the nutrients, the consistency, and the soil quality. Because you're using a potting mix, it's going to be very loose, and this is the way plant roots like it. They love it like that. They love to have loose soil. And speaking of soil quality, now one day, by this fall, there will be weed seeds getting blown into here and germinating. But there are no seeds inherent in the soil. So I'm going to be fairly weed-free for this summer. And it's going to be a lot easier to keep it weed-free. Number one, it's going to be really easy to pull the weeds out. And number two, well, because it is a raised bed, there's not going to be as many seeds landing in these beds as they will land just kind of everywhere else. The last pro to using a sub-irrigated raised bed, or really any kind of container garden, you can keep the pests out. I will never have a single mole in these beds. There's another gardener channel that I watch, and where he lives, he has groundhogs. And he has to cage up his cucumbers so that the groundhogs can't get at them while they got into them anyway. Now, obviously, if you have birds that love to eat fruit, yeah, they'll be able to have access to your tomatoes unless you cover them. But that's another thing about infrastructure. If you want to, you can put PVC hoops all over the beds. You know, just strap them into the sides like we strap the tomato stakes. And you can cover it with bird netting or whatever you want to cover it with to keep the pests out. But it's going to take, you know, very unlikely that mice or rats are going to try to climb up something this high, especially if they don't know that there's goodies growing in there, and so on. So it's a great mammal pest deterrent. So there you go, the pros and cons of sub-irrigation planters. If this video has helped you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your fellow gardeners or wannabe gardeners. I will see you for the next video. In the meantime, take care, be well, and happy gardening.